Mama, a fragile whisper trembles. Another echoes, soft, like a forgotten melody. Samuel Reed halts at the west door of his sprawling American mansion, briefcase heavy in his grip, the silence of his world shattered. The house, a cold fortress sealing grief since Elise's death, hums with something new. His eyes widen, stunned, as he peers into the nursery. Serenity Allen, the new maid, plays with Lila and Ivy, his 3-year-old twins, autistic and silent for years. She traces invisible shapes, butterflies, stars, moons. Lila's hand rises, mimicking. Ivy hums, alive. Samuel's briefcase slips, heart racing. How could a stranger unlock what experts couldn't? What secret does Serenity hold? Will this spark fade or light their world anew? Stay to uncover the truth. The door clicked shut behind Samuel Reed, sealing the nursery's faint hum in its frame. His briefcase hung heavy in his hand, a tether to the world he'd built. A sprawling American mansion, all marble and shadow, where silence was both shield and sentence. The word mama, whispered by his autistic twins, Lila and Ivy, still burned in his ears, a sound he'd never heard from them in their 3 years of life. His chest tightened, a knot of disbelief in something softer, unnameable, clawing at the edges of his control. He stood frozen in the hallway, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and absence, the echo of that fragile sound replaying like a forbidden melody. Samuel's mind churned. Lila and Ivy, diagnosed with severe autism, had never spoken, never smiled, their world a locked vault no specialist could breach. He'd sat through countless consultations in sterile rooms, nodding at charts and jargon, nonverbal, non-ambulatory, minimal responsiveness, as if they were equations to solve, not his daughters. After Elise's death, he'd buried hope beneath routine, crafting a life where grief couldn't slip through the cracks. The mansion was his fortress, each room a monument to order, every tick of the grandfather clock a reminder that time moved forward, but not for him. Yet in that nursery, Serenity Allen, a maid hired only weeks ago, had cracked the vault open. Her presence, unassuming yet undeniable, had drawn out a word, a sound, a spark. How? Why her? He pressed his back against the wall, the cool plaster grounding him. His fingers tightened around the briefcase, its leather creaking under the strain. Serenity's voice lingered in his mind, soft as a breeze, coaxing the twins in a way he hadn't dared since Elise's car spun off that rain-slicked road. Samuel's throat burned. He wasn't a cold man, not heartless, but he'd learned to live in the gray space between love and surrender, where expectations were dangerous. The twins' silence had been his mirror, reflecting a father who could provide but not connect. Now that mirror was fracturing. He moved down the hallway, steps slow, deliberate, as if testing the ground for traps. The nursery door stayed closed, but the hum of Serenity's voice seeped through, a thread of warmth in the mansion's sterile chill. Samuel paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob, then pulled back. He wasn't ready to face her, this stranger who'd stirred something his daughters hadn't known. Instead, he retreated to the library, its shelves heavy with books he never read, their spines as untouched as his heart. He set the briefcase down, its weight no longer a comfort, and sank into a leather chair. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp casting long shadows across the oak floor. Serenity. Her name rolled through his thoughts, unfamiliar, yet sharp. She was 30, black, hired through a trusted colleague's recommendation, her resume a list of quiet efficiencies, cleaning, organizing, discretion. She wasn't meant to matter. She was background, a shadow moving through the house to keep it spotless. Yet Samuel had noticed subtle shifts in the days since her arrival. The twins' eyes, once vacant, followed her when she crossed the room. Their fingers twitched when she hummed, a sound so faint it barely reached him. He dismissed it as a coincidence, as the nurses had. Their clipped voices citing sensory overstimulation or random reflex. But Mama wasn't random. It was a blade, cutting through years of silence. Samuel's hands clenched, knuckles whitening. He wanted to storm back to the nursery, demand answers. How had she done it? What right did she have to pull his daughters from their locked world when he, their father, couldn't? But the weight in his chest held him still, a mix of awe, shame, and fear. Awe at the impossible sound. Shame for his absence, for letting nurses and schedules raise his girls. Fear that this moment, this spark, would vanish like Elisa's laughter. He closed his eyes and for a moment he saw her, her hands cradling the twins, her voice promising they'd be okay. He hadn't believed her then. He didn't know if he could now. The library's silence pressed in, heavier than the nursery's warmth. Samuel stood restless and crossed to the window. Outside, the estate's manicured lawn stretched into darkness, a perfect facade hiding the chaos within him. He thought of Serenity's hands, gentle as they moved through the air, coaxing Lila to reach, Ivy to hum. He'd seen it just for a moment through the nursery door. His daughters alive in a way he'd forgotten they could be. His throat tightened, a lump he couldn't swallow. He wasn't ready to trust this, not yet. Trust was a luxury he'd lost. He returned to the nursery door, drawn back by a pull he couldn't name. Through the crack, he heard Serenity's voice again, low and steady, not singing now but speaking, her words soft as a lullaby. "You're doing so well, little ones," she said, her tone carrying a warmth that pierced Samuel's defenses. He peered inside, careful not to be seen. Lila sat on the rug, her small hand tapping the air, as if chasing the echo of Serenity's voice. Ivy's head tilted, her lips parting in a faint hum, not quite a word but a sound that held meaning. Samuel's heart stuttered. He'd paid thousands for therapists, flown in experts from across the country, yet here was a maid, a stranger, weaving a connection he'd never dared to try. "Why you?" he whispered to himself, the question bitter on his tongue. He didn't know Serenity, not really. Her file said she'd cared for a cousin with special needs, a detail he'd skimmed without thought. Now it gnawed at him. Did she see something in Lila and Ivy that he'd missed? Or was she simply there, present in a way he hadn't been? The thought stung, sharp and raw. He'd given his daughters everything, doctors, nurses, a house that gleamed, but not himself, not his heart. Serenity knelt closer, her hands guiding a soft ball toward Lila. The girl's fingers brushed it, tentative, then pulled back. Serenity didn't push, just smiled, her voice a steady anchor. "That's it, sweetheart," she said. "You're right there." Samuel's breath caught. He saw it then, in the way Lila's eyes flickered, in Ivy's faint hum, a spark, not just of sound, but of trust. They were reaching for her, not him. The realization was a knife, twisting in his gut. He wanted to step inside, to demand she explain, to reclaim his place, but his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, the wood cool against his forehead. The nursery's warmth seeped through the crack, a contrast to the mansion's cold order. He thought of Elise, how she'd sing to the twins before they were born, her voice a promise he couldn't keep. Serenity's presence felt like an echo of that promise, but it wasn't his to claim, not yet. He straightened, the briefcase still at his side, a reminder of the life he'd chosen, one of distance, of control. But control was slipping, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted it back. Samuel stepped away, the hallway swallowing his footsteps. He didn't return to the library. Instead, he wandered to the glass doors overlooking the estate's gardens, their shadows stretching long and lonely. The word mama echoed in his mind, not just a sound but a question. Could he learn to be the father his daughters needed? Could he trust this stranger who'd unlocked their world? The answers were out of reach, but the spark was real. And once you've heard your silent children speak, even a whisper, you don't walk away unchanged. The hallway stretched before Samuel Reed, a long, shadowed tunnel swallowing his footsteps as he moved away from the nursery door. The faint hum of Serenity Allen's voice lingered, a ghost of warmth that refused to fade, tugging at the edges of his unraveling control. His briefcase, still clutched in one hand, felt like an anchor, grounding him in a world he'd meticulously crafted. A world where grief was locked behind marble walls, where his daughter's silence was a truth he'd accepted. But Mama, that single word from Lila and Ivy, had pierced the quiet like a blade. And now Samuel's heart pounded with a rhythm he didn't recognize. It wasn't just shock, it was something deeper, a collision of hope and fear that made his chest ache as if it might crack open. He paused at the end of the hall, where a tall window framed the estate's sprawling gardens, their edges blurred in the dusk. The mansion, a monument to his success, loomed around him, its polished surfaces reflecting nothing but his own hollow gaze. Samuel had built this life to keep pain at bay, to shield himself from the void left by Elise's death. Lila and Ivy, his 3-year-old twins, had been born into that void, their autism a wall he couldn't climb. Specialists had filled his days with terms: severe spectrum disorder, nonverbal, minimal motor response, each word a brick in the fortress he'd erected around his heart. He'd paid for the best care, hired nurses, flown in experts, but their reports were always the same: no progress, no connection, no hope. He'd learned to nod, to sign checks, to move forward. But forward to what? Now Serenity, a maid hired through a colleague's word, had shattered that certainty. Samuel leaned against the window, the glass cold against his palm, and closed his eyes. The memory of her voice, soft and steady, played in his mind, not as a song but as a lifeline, pulling his daughters from their locked world. He saw Lila's hand rise, tentative, chasing something unseen. Ivy's hum, faint but deliberate, echoed in his ears. His throat tightened, a lump he couldn't swallow. He wasn't a man who cried. He hadn't since Elise's funeral, when the rain had masked his tears. But now his eyes stung with the weight of something he couldn't name. He turned, drawn back to the nursery, unable to stay away. The door was still closed, but through the narrow crack, he heard Serenity's voice again, not speaking now but humming, a low, rhythmic melody that seemed to weave the air itself. Samuel pressed his hand to the doorframe, his fingers trembling. He didn't open it. Instead, he listened, letting the sound wash over him like a tide. "Keep going, little ones," Serenity said, her words barely audible, yet they carried a warmth that made the hallway feel less empty. Samuel's breath hitched. He pictured his daughters, their small forms on the rug, their eyes, once so distant, fixed on her. What did she have that he didn't? What magic did she wield to draw out sounds he'd never dreamed possible? His mind flashed to the years of silence, the nights he'd sat in his office, staring at financial reports while nurses tended to Lila and Ivy. He'd told himself it was enough, providing, protecting, ensuring their world was safe. But safe from what? From him? From the father who couldn't face their stillness, who feared their blank gazes would mirror his own failure? Samuel's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the briefcase. Serenity wasn't just a maid. She was a mirror, reflecting everything he'd avoided. Her presence, unassuming yet unshakable, was a quiet accusation. He'd been absent, not in body but in soul. He moved to the staircase, each step a descent into his own thoughts. The mansion's grandeur, its chandeliers, its oak paneling, felt oppressive now, a cage of his own making. He reached the drawing room, its velvet curtains drawn tight, shutting out the world. He set the briefcase on a table, its thud echoing in the stillness. Serenity's file sat in his memory, a few lines he'd barely glanced at. 30, black, experienced, reliable. A colleague had vouched for her, saying she'd cared for a cousin with special needs. That detail, once insignificant, now loomed large. Did she see Lila and Ivy as more than a diagnosis? Did she see what he'd stopped looking for? Samuel sank into an armchair, the leather creaking under his weight. He rubbed his temples, trying to push back the flood of questions. Serenity's hum drifted through the house, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat he hadn't noticed until now. He thought of Elise, her laughter filling this room once, her hands guiding his to feel the twins' kicks before they were born. She'd believed in them, in him, in a future where love could bridge any gap. He'd failed her, failed them, by letting silence become his language. But Serenity, she spoke to the twins as if they could answer, as if their world wasn't locked shut. and they had answered. He stood restless and crossed to a bookshelf, his fingers brushing the spines. He didn't know why he moved, only that sitting still felt like surrender. The nursery called to him, a pull he couldn't ignore. He climbed the stairs again, slower this time, each step a negotiation with his fear. At the nursery door he stopped, peering through the crack. Serenity sat cross-legged on the rug, a small rattle in her hand, shaking it gently. Lila's fingers twitched, reaching toward the sound. Ivy's head tilted, her lips parting in a soft hum. Not quite a word, but a response, alive and real. Serenity smiled, her voice a whisper. "That's it, sweethearts," she said. "I hear you." Samuel's heart twisted, a sharp pang of envy and gratitude. Envy for the ease with which she reached his daughters. Gratitude for the sound she'd drawn out, a sound he'd thought impossible. He wanted to step inside, to ask her how, to demand she teach him. But his feet stayed rooted, his hand gripping the doorframe. He wasn't ready, not to trust, not to hope, not to face the father he'd failed to be. Serenity's presence was a crack in his armor, and he didn't know if it would save him or break him. He thought of the specialists, their endless reports, their sterile assurances that Lila and Ivy were stable. Stable, as if that was enough. He'd nodded, paid, moved on. But stability wasn't life. Serenity, with her quiet persistence, had brought life back to the nursery, to his daughters. Samuel's eyes burned again, and he blinked hard, pushing back the tears. He didn't cry. He couldn't. But the weight of silence was shifting, replaced by something fragile, something alive. He stepped back, the hallway swallowing him once more. The nursery door stayed closed, but its warmth lingered, a promise he wasn't sure he could claim. Serenity's hum followed him, a thread of hope he couldn't yet grasp, but couldn't let go. Samuel Reed lingered at the edge of the drawing room, the echo of Serenity Allen's hum still threading through his thoughts, a fragile lifeline pulling him back to the nursery. The mansion's vastness pressed around him, its silence no longer a comfort, but a weight, heavy with the memory of his daughter's whispered, "Mama." His fingers traced the rim of a porcelain teacup, long gone cold, as he stood by the window. The estate's gardens fading into twilight. The spark he'd heard, Lila's reaching hand, Ivy's faint hum, had ignited something in him, a flicker of hope he didn't trust. It was too raw, too sudden, like a wound reopened. Samuel's heart thudded, caught between awe and dread, as he grappled with the truth. A maid, a stranger, had stirred his silent twins when he, their father, had failed. He set the teacup down, its clink sharp in the quiet. The drawing room, with its velvet drapes and polished mahogany, felt like a stage for a life he no longer recognized. Samuel had spent years building barriers, against grief, against failure, against the piercing guilt of surviving Elise's absence. Lila and Ivy, locked in their autistic world, had been his mirror, their silence reflecting his own. He'd filled their days with nurses, schedules, and specialists, their reports a litany of limits, nonverbal, non-responsive, unlikely to connect. He'd nodded, signed their fees, and buried himself in work, believing structure was love. But Serenity's presence, unassuming yet unshakable, had cracked that belief, and Samuel felt the fracture deep in his bones. He moved toward the nursery again, drawn by a pull he couldn't name. The hallway's shadows stretched long, swallowing his steps, but the faint glow from the nursery door felt like a beacon. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he stood just outside, his hand resting on the frame, listening. Serenity's voice floated through, not humming now, but speaking, soft as a whisper carried on the wind. "You're so brave, my darlings," she said, her words a gentle tide lapping at Samuel's defenses. He peered through the crack, his breath shallow, afraid to disturb the moment. Lila sat on the rug, her small fingers curling toward a spinning top Serenity held, its slow whirl catching the light. Ivy's head tilted, her lips parting in a faint, breathy sound. Not a word, but a response, alive with intent. Samuel's chest tightened, a storm of emotions swirling within. Awe at the sight of his daughters responding, their eyes no longer vacant but fixed on Serenity. Envy, sharp and bitter, that she could reach them so effortlessly when he'd faltered. Guilt, heavy as the mansion itself, for letting nurses raise his girls while he hid behind his wealth. And beneath it all, a spark of hope, fragile as glass, that maybe, just maybe, his daughter's world wasn't as locked as he'd believed. He pressed his forehead to the doorframe, the wood cool against his skin, and let the moment wash over him. Serenity's voice was a lifeline, but it also cut, reminding him of what he'd failed to give. He thought of Elise, her laughter once filling these halls, her hands guiding his to the twins' cribs, promising they'd find a way. He'd let that promise slip, trading it for control, for safety. But safety had become a cage, and Serenity was unlocking it. Samuel's fingers tightened, nails digging into his palms. Who was she? This woman who'd slipped past his defenses? Her file was a blur in his mind. 30 black, recommended for her quiet efficiency. But there was something else, a detail he'd overlooked. She'd cared for a cousin with special needs. Did that explain it? Did she see Lila and Ivy not as diagnoses, but as children, capable of reaching back? The thought stung, a quiet accusation of his own blindness. Serenity's voice shifted, now guiding the top closer to Lila. Look at that spin, she said, her tone bright but steady, like a candle in a storm. Lila's hand reached out, trembling, then pulled back, as if testing the air. Ivy's head swayed, her breathy hum growing stronger, a rhythm only she understood. Samuel's heart lurched. He'd seen specialists try for years, sensory toys, rigid protocols, endless charts, yet none had drawn this response. Serenity, with nothing but a spinning top and her voice, had done what they couldn't. He wanted to step inside, to ask her how, to demand she share her secret. But his feet stayed rooted, heavy with the weight of his own absence. A flicker of doubt crept in, cold and sharp. Was this real, or was it a trick of his desperate mind, seeing meaning where there was none? The nurses had warned him, random responses, sensory flares, not true connection. But this felt different. Lila's reaching hand, Ivy's hum, they weren't random. They were deliberate, a bridge to serenity. Samuel's throat burned, a lump he couldn't swallow. He'd built a life where hope was a risk, where love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet here in the nursery's soft glow, hope was alive, and it terrified him. He stepped back, the hallway's darkness swallowing him. The nursery door stayed closed, but Serenity's voice followed, a thread he couldn't cut. He wandered to the glass doors overlooking the gardens, their shadows twisting in the twilight. He saw Elise in his mind, her smile promising a future he'd let slip away. Serenity wasn't Elise, but her presence echoed that same promise, a promise of connection, of life. Samuel's hands trembled, the doubt warring with the spark he'd seen. Was Serenity a savior or a mirage? Could he learn to reach his daughters, or would he lose them to her light? He turned, drawn back to the nursery's glow. Through the crack, he saw Serenity set the top aside, now clapping softly, her hands moving in a slow rhythm. Lila's fingers twitched, mimicking the motion. Ivy's hum grew louder, a melody of trust. Samuel's breath caught, his heart a tangled knot of longing and fear. He wasn't ready to trust this stranger, not yet. But the spark was real, and it burned in him now, a flame he couldn't extinguish. He stepped away, the hallway's silence no longer empty, but alive with questions he couldn't answer. Samuel Reed stood in the dim glow of the hallway, the nursery's warmth fading behind him as he moved toward the grand staircase. Serenity Allen's voice, soft and unwavering, lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't unhear, pulling at the frayed edges of his heart. The spark he'd seen in Lila and Ivy, those tentative reaches, those breathy hums, had cracked something in him, a fracture that let doubt and hope seep through in equal measure. His fingers brushed the banister, its polished wood cool against his skin, but the touch offered no comfort. The mansion, once a fortress of control, felt unsteady now, as if its walls were shifting under the weight of a single word. Mama. Samuel's chest tightened, a storm of emotions, guilt, envy, and a longing he couldn't name, threatening to spill over. He descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last, the silence of the house no longer a shield but a mirror, reflecting his own failures. Layla and Ivy, his 3-year-old twins, locked in their autistic world, had answered serenity when no one else, not specialists, not nurses, not him, had reached them. He'd built a life to keep pain at bay, filling their days with routines and experts, believing structure was enough. But structure wasn't love, and love was what he'd seen in the nursery, in the way Serenity's presence drew his daughters out. Samuel's throat burned, the memory of their hums cutting deeper than he'd expected. He wasn't a cold man, not heartless, but he'd let distance become his language, and now a stranger spoke where he couldn't. He reached the kitchen, its marble counters gleaming under soft light, a space as pristine as his carefully curated life. A teacup sat on the island, its contents cold, a remnant of his restless night. Samuel gripped it, the porcelain grounding him as he wrestled with the question that gnawed at his core. Why her? Serenity, hired only weeks ago, was meant to be invisible, a maid to keep the house spotless, not to rewrite his daughter's story. Yet her quiet persistence had done what thousands in medical fees couldn't. He set the teacup down, the clink sharp, and moved toward the nursery again, drawn by a need he couldn't suppress. The hallway shadows seemed to pulse, as if the house itself sensed the change. At the nursery door, Samuel paused, his hand hovering over the knob. Serenity's voice floated through, not humming now but speaking, low and deliberate, like a river smoothing stones. "You're so strong, little ones," she said, her words carrying a warmth that pierced Samuel's defenses. He pushed the door open, just enough to see without being seen. Serenity knelt on the rug, a small wooden block in her hand, moving it slowly in a circle. Lila's fingers twitched, reaching toward the block, her eyes fixed on it with a focus Samuel hadn't seen. Ivy's head swayed, her lips parting in a soft hum, not a word but a sound that held meaning, like a heartbeat breaking through silence. Samuel's breath caught, his heart a tangled knot of awe and pain. He stepped inside, the floor creaking under his weight. Serenity looked up, her gaze calm but steady, unshaken by his sudden presence. "What are you doing?" Samuel asked, his voice sharper than intended, edged with a doubt he couldn't hide. Serenity set the block down, her hands still. "Playing with them," she said simply. "They like the rhythm." Samuel's jaw tightened. "They don't play," he said, the words heavy with years of medical reports. "They don't respond like that." Serenity tilted her head, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "They do," she said. "You just haven't seen it." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Samuel's defenses. He wanted to argue, to demand proof, but Lila's hand reached out again, brushing the block, deliberate, not random. Ivy's hum grew louder, a melody of trust. Samuel's chest ached, envy and guilt colliding. "You're not their mother," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. Serenity nodded, her expression softening. "I know," she said. "I'm just here." The simplicity of her answer stung, a quiet truth that exposed his absence. He'd been here, in the house, but not for them. Not in the way that mattered. Samuel's hands clenched, nails digging into his palms. "What do you want?" he asked, the question spilling out before he could stop it. "Recognition? A story to tell?" The doubt he'd felt in the hallway flared, sharp and cold. Serenity's cousin, the one with special needs, she'd mentioned it once, a detail he'd barely noted. Was this her motive? A chance to prove something? Serenity didn't flinch. "My cousin was like them," she said, her voice steady but soft. "No one listened to him. I'm listening to your girls." Her words were a blade, cutting through his suspicion, leaving only shame. He looked at Lila and Ivy, their small forms bathed in the nursery's soft light. Lila's fingers lingered near the block, her eyes still on it. Ivy's head swayed, her hum a fragile thread connecting her to Serenity. Samuel's throat burned, a lump he couldn't swallow. He'd paid for experts, for machines, for a house that gleamed, but he hadn't listened. He hadn't tried the way Serenity did, with nothing but patience and presence. The realization was a weight, pressing down until he could barely breathe. He wanted to speak, to ask her how she'd done it, but his voice failed him. Serenity knelt closer, her hand guiding the block in a slow arc. "You see it, don't you?" she said to Lila, her voice a whisper of encouragement. Lila's hand followed, tentative but sure. Ivy's hum shifted, a note higher, as if answering. Samuel watched, rooted to the spot, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and grief. He'd failed his daughters, not by neglect, but by fear. Fear of hoping, of failing again. Serenity wasn't afraid. She was there, fully in a way he'd forgotten how to be. He stepped back, the nursery's warmth overwhelming. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Serenity looked up, her gaze gentle but unflinching. "You don't have to," she said. "Just watch them." Samuel's eyes burned, the thread of tears he hadn't shed in years. He turned, the doorframe catching his hand as he steadied himself. The nursery's light spilled into the hallway, a glow he couldn't escape. He left, the weight of doubt still heavy, but something else stirred. A flicker of belief, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Samuel Reed retreated from the nursery door, Serenity Allen's words, "Just watch them," echoing like a pulse in his mind, steady yet unsettling. The hallway's shadows clung to him as he moved, each step a wrestle with the fracture she'd opened in his heart. The doubt he'd hurled at her, sharp with suspicion, had dulled against her quiet truth, leaving him raw, exposed. His fingers brushed the banister, its smooth curve a fleeting anchor, as he descended the grand staircase. The mansion's silence no longer a refuge, but a canvas, painted with the faint hum of his daughter's response. Lila and Ivy, locked in their autistic world, had reached for serenity, and Samuel, their father, stood on the outside, grasping for a way back in. His chest ached, a tangle of guilt and longing, as he wondered if he could ever be more than a shadow in their lives. He reached the conservatory, its glass walls framing the estate's gardens, their edges softened by dawn's first light. A teacup sat forgotten on a side table, its rim chipped from restless nights. Samuel gripped it, the porcelain cool against his palm, grounding him as he stared into the morning haze. The mansion, once a fortress of control, felt different now, as if Serenity's presence had stirred a current through its sterile air. He'd built this life to keep grief at bay, to shield himself from the void left by Elise's absence. Lila and Ivy, his 3-year-old twins, had been born into that void, their autism a wall he'd accepted as permanent. Specialists had drawn lines, nonverbal, non-responsive, limited potential, and he'd nodded, believing structure was enough. But structure wasn't life, and life was what he'd seen in the nursery, in the way Serenity's voice drew his daughters out. Samuel set the teacup down, its clink a faint echo in the vast room. He moved to a wicker chair, its creak breaking the stillness, and sank into it, his thoughts a storm. Serenity's words haunted him, not as an accusation but as a mirror, reflecting his absence. He'd been there, in the house, providing nurses, schedules, a gleaming prison of care, but he hadn't been present, not in the way that made Lila reach, that made Ivy hum. His throat tightened, a lump he couldn't swallow, as he pictured Elise's hands, once guiding his to their cribs, her voice promising they'd find a way. He'd let that promise fade, trading it for distance, for safety. But safety was a lie, and Serenity was proving it. The conservatory's glass seemed to pulse with the morning light, and Samuel felt a pull back to the nursery, a need to see if the spark he'd witnessed was real. He climbed the stairs, his steps softer now, as if afraid to disturb the house's newfound rhythm. At the nursery door he paused, his hand hovering, the memory of Serenity's calm gaze holding him still. He peered through the crack, his breath shallow. Serenity sat on the rug, a small wooden ring in her hand, rolling it gently toward Lila. The girl's fingers twitched, reaching for it, her eyes locked on the motion with a focus that stole Samuel's breath. Ivy sat nearby, her head tilting, lips parting in a faint hum, a sound that carried meaning, like a whisper from a locked room. Samuel's heart stuttered, a mix of awe and pain washing over him. Awe at the sight of his daughters, once so distant, responding to Serenity's quiet presence. Pain, sharp as a blade, that he hadn't been the one to draw them out. He'd paid for experts, for machines, for a house that gleamed, but he hadn't sat on the rug, hadn't rolled a ring, hadn't hummed. Serenity, a maid hired for her efficiency, had done what he couldn't. He leaned against the doorframe, his fingers digging into the wood, the ache in his chest growing heavier. He wanted to step inside to join them, but fear held him back. Fear of failing again, of hoping only to lose. Serenity's voice broke through, soft but steady. "You're right there, aren't you?" she said to Lila, her tone a gentle invitation. Lila's hand reached again, brushing the ring, deliberate, not random. Ivy's hum grew stronger, a melody of trust, as if answering. Samuel's eyes burned, the thread of tears he hadn't shed since Elise's funeral. He saw her in his mind, her laughter filling the house, her hands promising a future he'd let slip away. Serenity wasn't Elise, but her presence carried the same quiet strength, a strength he'd forgotten how to wield. He wanted to hate her for it, to push her away, but the spark in his daughter's eyes held him captive. He thought of Serenity's cousin, the one with special needs, a detail he'd barely noted when hiring her. It gnawed at him now, a clue to her ease, her patience. She'd seen this before, known this world, and yet she chose to step into his, to sit with his daughters when no one else could. Samuel's throat burned, guilt and gratitude colliding. He'd been absent, not in body, but in heart, leaving Lila and Ivy to nurses and schedules. Serenity had filled that absence, not with expertise, but with something simpler, something he'd lost: presence. He stepped back, the nursery's glow spilling into the hallway, a light he couldn't escape. The conservatory called him, its glass walls a fragile barrier between him and the world. He returned, sinking into the wicker chair, the teacup still on the table, a silent witness to his turmoil. Serenity's voice drifted through the house, faint but persistent, like a pulse he couldn't ignore. He saw Lila's reaching hand, Ivy's swaying head, and felt a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. He wasn't ready to trust, not fully, but the mansion wasn't silent anymore. It hummed with life, with possibility, and Samuel, for the first time, didn't want to run from it. Samuel Reed stood in the conservatory's fading light, the pulse of Serenity Allen's presence still humming through him, a rhythm that refused to quiet. The nursery's glow lingered in his mind. Lila's reaching hand and Ivy's soft hum painting a crack across the wall he'd built around his heart. The mansion, once a fortress of silence, felt alive now, its air stirred by a warmth he couldn't name. His fingers brushed a chipped teacup on the side table, its weight grounding him as he wrestled with the truth. Serenity, a maid, had reached his autistic twins in ways he never had. His chest tightened, a storm of doubt and longing swirling within, threatening to pull him under. He wasn't ready to trust her, not fully, but the spark she'd ignited in Lila and Ivy was undeniable, a flame that both warmed and burned. He moved through the mansion, his steps slow, drawn back to the nursery by a need he couldn't shake. The grand staircase creaked under his weight, each step a descent into the tangle of his thoughts. Serenity's words from their last encounter, "Just watch them," echoed not as a challenge but as a quiet plea, urging him to see what she saw. Samuel's throat burned, the memory of Lila's tentative reach and Ivy's hum cutting deeper than he'd expected. He'd spent years hiding behind schedules, nurses, and specialists, their reports a litany of limits: nonverbal, non-responsive, no hope. He'd accepted it, let it define his daughters, but Serenity had rewritten that truth with nothing more than her presence. His hands clenched, nails digging into his palms as he reached the nursery door. He paused, his hand hovering over the knob, the faint sound of Serenity's voice seeping through the wood. It wasn't singing now, but a soft murmur, like a breeze coaxing leaves to dance. Samuel pushed the door open, just enough to see without being noticed. Serenity knelt on the rug, a small bell in her hand, its gentle chime filling the room. Lila sat nearby, her fingers twitching toward the sound. Her eyes locked on the bell with a focus that stole Samuel's breath. Ivy swayed, her lips parting in a faint hum, a sound that carried meaning, like a whisper breaking through a locked door. Samuel's heart pounded, awe and pain colliding. His daughters, silent for so long, were answering her, not him. He stepped inside, the floor creaking under his weight. Serenity looked up, her gaze calm but unwavering, as if she'd expected him. "What are you doing?" Samuel asked, his voice low, edged with a doubt he couldn't suppress. Serenity set the bell down, its chime fading into silence. "Playing with them," she said simply. "They like the sound." Samuel's jaw tightened, the words stirring a familiar sting. "They don't play," he said, echoing the specialist's cold assurances. "They don't respond like that." Serenity tilted her head, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "They do," she said. "You're just not listening." The words landed like a stone, rippling through the still pool of his defenses. Samuel's chest ached, guilt and envy twisting together. He wanted to argue, to demand proof, but Lila's hand reached for the bell, her fingers brushing it, deliberate, not random. Ivy's hum grew stronger, a melody of trust. Samuel's breath caught, his doubt warring with the truth before him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "What do you want from them?" The question spilled out, raw and unfiltered, born from the fear that Serenity's kindness had a price. Recognition? A story to tell? He'd heard of caregivers seeking fame, turning private struggles into public triumphs. Serenity didn't flinch. "My cousin was like them," she said, her voice steady but soft, like a candle in the dark. "No one heard him. I'm hearing your girls." Her words cut through Samuel's suspicion, leaving only shame. He looked at Lila and Ivy, their small forms bathed in the nursery's soft light. Lila's fingers lingered near the bell, her eyes still fixed on it. Ivy swayed, her hum a fragile thread connecting her to Serenity. Samuel's throat burned, a lump he couldn't swallow. He'd paid for experts, for machines, for a house that gleamed, but he hadn't listened. He hadn't heard. Serenity knelt closer, her hand guiding the bell in a slow arc. "You hear it, don't you?" she said to Lila, her tone a gentle invitation. Lila's hand followed, tentative but sure. Ivy's hum shifted, a note higher, as if answering. Samuel watched, rooted to the spot, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and grief. He'd failed his daughters not by neglect, but by fear. Fear of hoping, of failing again. Serenity wasn't afraid. She was there, fully in a way he'd forgotten how to be. A faint rustle broke his thoughts. A small piece of paper slipped from Serenity's pocket, landing on the rug. Samuel bent to pick it up, his fingers trembling. It was a note, scrawled in neat handwriting. "Lila reaches when I ring the bell." Ivy hums to low notes. He stared at it, his heart lurching. "You're keeping notes?" he asked, his voice tight, suspicion flaring again. Serenity nodded, her gaze steady. "To remember what they do," she said. "The nurses don't always see." Samuel's grip tightened on the paper, the words a mirror to his absence. "You think you know them better than me?" he asked, the question sharp, but his voice broke, betraying the pain beneath. Serenity's eyes softened. "I don't know them better," she said. "I'm just here." The simplicity of her answer stung, a quiet truth that exposed his distance. Samuel's eyes burned, the threat of tears he hadn't shed in years. He looked at the note again, then at his daughters. Lila's hand brushed the bell. Ivy's hum grew louder, and then it happened. A sound, faint but clear. "Shh," Lila whispered, her lips struggling to shape the sound. Ivy echoed, "Shh," a breathy call. Samuel's knees weakened, his heart a tangled knot of shock and wonder. "They're trying to say your name," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Serenity nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's not my name," she said. "It's trust." Samuel stood frozen, the paper trembling in his hand. The nursery's light seemed to pulse, a glow that held him captive. He wanted to speak, to ask her how, but the sound of his daughter's voices, fragile, fleeting, stopped him. He'd waited years for a sign, and now it was here, in a maid's gentle presence. He stepped back, the note still in his hand, the weight of trust heavier than he'd ever known. Samuel Reed lingered in the hallway, the nursery's glow fading behind him, but the echo of Lila and Ivy's "sss" burned in his chest, a sound of trust that Serenity Allen had drawn from his silent twins. The Maugai, with her careful notes, trembled in his hand, a fragile testament to her presence. His heart pounded, a tangle of awe and fear, as he moved toward the dining room, its long oak table stretching empty before him. The mansion, once a cold fortress, hummed with a life he hadn't felt since Elise's laughter filled its halls. Serenity had unlocked something, his daughter's voices, his own buried hope. And now the thought of her leaving twisted in his gut like a knife. He set the paper down, its edges curling, and gripped a teacup, its porcelain cool against his palm, anchoring him as he wrestled with the truth. He needed her, and so did his girls. The dining room's chandelier cast fractured light across the walls, mirroring the cracks in Samuel's resolve. Lila and Ivy, his 3-year-old twins trapped in their autistic world, had reached for serenity in a way he'd never seen. Their hums, their tentative hands were more than responses. They were bridges, built by a maid who'd slipped past his defenses. Samuel's throat tightened, the memory of their "sss," a spark that both warmed and terrified him. He'd built this life to avoid pain, filling it with nurses, schedules, and specialists who spoke of limits. Nonverbal, non-responsive, no connection. He'd accepted it, let it define his daughters, but Serenity had rewritten that truth with nothing but her quiet presence. His fingers clenched around the teacup, the ache in his chest growing heavier. What if she left? What if the spark she'd ignited flickered out? He moved to the window, the estate's gardens blurring in the evening light. Serenity's words, "It's trust," echoed, a quiet truth that pierced his armor. He'd doubted her, questioned her motives, but her answer, rooted in her cousin's silent world, had silenced his suspicions. She wasn't here for fame or gain. She was here for Lila and Ivy, seeing them as he hadn't dared. Samuel's eyes burned, a lump rising in his throat. He saw Elise in his mind, her hands cradling the twins, her voice promising they'd find a way. He'd failed that promise, hiding behind wealth, but Serenity was keeping it alive, and he couldn't let her go. A soft rustle broke his thoughts. A folded envelope lay on the table, its edges worn, as if touched too many times. Samuel picked it up, his fingers trembling. It was addressed to Serenity, the letterhead from a renowned autism center in the city, offering her a role as a caregiver, a chance to work with experts. His heart sank, a cold wave of fear washing over him. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't hinted at leaving, but the envelope was real, a threat to the fragile light she'd brought. Samuel's grip tightened, crumpling the paper. He wanted to tear it, to burn it, to keep her here, but the choice wasn't his. He set it down, his hands shaking, and moved toward the nursery, drawn by a need to see his daughters, to see her. The hallway's shadows seemed to pulse, guiding him to the nursery door. He paused, his hand hovering, Serenity's voice drifting through, soft as a lullaby. "You're so close, my darlings," she said, her words a gentle tide. Samuel peered through the crack, his breath shallow. Serenity sat on the rug, a small toy drum in her hand, tapping a slow rhythm. Lila's fingers reached toward the sound, her eyes locked on the drum with a focus that stole Samuel's breath. Ivy swayed, her lips parting in a faint hum, a sound that carried trust, like a whisper from a locked room. Samuel's chest ached, awe and fear colliding. His daughters were alive, responding, because of her. He stepped inside, the floor creaking under his weight. Serenity looked up, her gaze calm but steady. "You're back," she said, her voice soft, not surprised. Samuel's throat tightened, the envelope's weight heavy in his mind. "I found this," he said, holding it up, his voice low, edged with fear. "You're leaving?" Serenity set the drum down, its rhythm fading. I haven't decided, she said simply, her eyes meeting his without flinching. Samuel's jaw clenched, the question spilling out. Why didn't you tell me? His voice broke, betraying the panic beneath. They need you. Serenity's gaze softened, but she didn't look away. They need you, she said. You're their father. The words landed like a stone, rippling through his guilt. Samuel's hands trembled, the envelope crumpling further. I don't know how, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've tried, but I'm not you. Serenity shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. You don't need to be me, she said. Just be here. The simplicity of her answer stung, a quiet truth that exposed his absence. Samuel looked at Lila and Ivy, their small forms bathed in the nursery's soft light. Lila's hand lingered near the drum, her fingers twitching. Ivy's hum grew stronger, a melody of trust. Samuel's heart pounded, a mix of fear and longing. He'd failed them, not by neglect, but by hiding from hope. Serenity hadn't. She'd seen his daughters, heard them, when he hadn't dared. He set the envelope on a shelf, his hand shaking. Stay, he said, the word raw, almost a plea. Serenity didn't answer, her eyes on the twins, but the silence held a promise. Michael, Elise's brother, stepped into the room, his presence unexpected. He'd come unannounced, drawn by stories of the twins' progress. He watched Lila reach, Ivy hum, and turned to Samuel, his voice low. She's their bridge, he said. Don't let it break. Samuel's throat burned, Michael's words echoing Serenity's truth. He nodded, unable to speak, and left the envelope behind. That night he sat at the dining table, a blank sheet of paper before him. He wrote, his hand unsteady. Serenity, your family. Stay. He left it on the table, a choice offered, not demanded. The nursery's light spilled through the house, a glow he couldn't escape. Samuel Reed stood in the dining room, the oak table bearing the weight of his unwritten hopes, where the letter he'd left for Serenity Allen lay. Its words, your family, stay, still echoing in his mind. The nursery's glow, the fragile sss from Lila and Ivy, had shifted something deep within him, a crack in the fortress of his heart that let light seep through. His fingers brushed the letter's edge, now signed with Serenity's steady hand, her acceptance a quiet promise that tethered him to a future he hadn't dared imagine. The mansion, once a silent cage, hummed with a rhythm he could no longer ignore, a pulse of life stirred by his daughter's trust in a woman who'd become more than a maid. Samuel's chest swelled, a mix of gratitude and longing, as he realized the spark she'd ignited was no longer hers alone. It was theirs. He moved through the hallway, his steps lighter, drawn to the nursery by a need to be part of its warmth. The grand staircase, once a barrier, now felt like a bridge, leading him to Lila and Ivy, his 3-year-old twins, locked in their autistic world, yet reaching out in ways he'd never seen. Serenity's presence had done that, her quiet strength pulling them from silence. Samuel's throat tightened, the memory of their sss, a melody he couldn't unhear. He'd spent years hiding behind nurses, schedules, and specialists, their reports a litany of limits, nonverbal, non-responsive, no hope. But Serenity had rewritten that truth, and Samuel, for the first time, wanted to learn her language, not just for his daughters, but for himself. He reached the nursery door, its soft light spilling into the hall, and pushed it open. Serenity sat on the rug, a small toy xylophone in her hands, tapping a gentle rhythm. Lila's fingers reached toward the sound, her eyes bright with focus. Ivy swayed, her lips parting in a faint hum, a sound that carried trust, like a whisper breaking through a locked room. Samuel's heart stuttered, awe and gratitude washing over him. He stepped inside, the floor creaking, and Serenity looked up, her gaze calm but warm. You're here, she said, her voice a gentle invitation, not surprised but welcoming. Samuel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He knelt beside her, awkward at first, his hands unsure. Can I try? He asked, his voice low, almost a plea. Serenity smiled, handing him the xylophone. Just tap, she said. They'll hear you. Samuel's fingers trembled, the mallet heavy in his hand. He tapped a note, soft and uncertain, and Lila's hand twitched, reaching toward the sound. Ivy's hum grew stronger, a melody of connection. Samuel's eyes burned, a lump rising he couldn't swallow. He'd failed them, not by absence, but by fear. Fear of hoping, of failing again. But now, in this moment, he was here. The nursery felt alive, its air pulsing with possibility. Samuel tapped another note, his rhythm unsteady but earnest. Lila's fingers brushed the xylophone, her touch fleeting but deliberate. Ivy swayed, her hum a soft echo of his note. Serenity watched, her presence a quiet anchor, not guiding but supporting. Samuel's chest ached, gratitude and guilt colliding. He saw Elise in his mind, her laughter promising a future he'd let slip away. Serenity wasn't Elise, but her strength carried that same promise, and Samuel was learning to hold it. Michael, Elise's brother, stepped into the room, his visit unannounced but timely. He'd heard whispers of the twins' progress, drawn by a hope he hadn't felt since Elise's death. He watched Lila reach, Ivy hum, and turned to Samuel, his voice low. "They're different," he said. "She's brought them back." Samuel shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "She showed me how to see them." Michael nodded, his eyes soft. "Don't let this go," he said, and Samuel felt the weight of his words, a call to hold on to this fragile light. The day unfolded and Serenity suggested taking the twins outside, to the garden where grass grew wild, untouched since Elise's time. Samuel hesitated, his instinct to control flaring, but he followed, carrying a blanket to spread on the ground. The garden's air was warm, scented with earth and possibility. Serenity set up a low swing, its ropes sturdy with padded supports. She lifted Lila gently, then Ivy, securing them side by side. Samuel pushed, his hands steady, the swing's creak a soft rhythm. Lila and Ivy began to play, their small hands clapping, feet twitching, bodies swaying as if dancing to an unseen melody. Their laughter rang out, bright and broken, like a stream finding its course. Samuel's heart swelled, a flood of joy and pain. He pushed the swing, each arc a step toward his daughters. Lila's hands clapped in rhythm. Ivy's hum joined the creak, a song of trust. Serenity stood nearby, her smile quiet but bright. "They're playing," she said, her voice a whisper of wonder. Samuel nodded, his eyes wet, the tears he'd held back for years spilling over. He saw Elise in the twins' laughter, in their swaying, and for the first time, he didn't feel her absence as a wound. He felt her presence, in them, in him. The garden seemed to hum, its wild grass a canvas for this moment. Samuel pushed harder, the swing rising higher, Lila and Ivy's laughter growing louder, a melody that filled the air. Serenity joined them, her hands steadying the ropes, her hum blending with theirs. Samuel's throat burned, gratitude overwhelming him. He'd built a fortress to keep pain out, but Serenity had shown him that love was the only way through. He looked at his daughters, their hands clapping, their bodies swaying, and felt a rhythm he hadn't known he needed, a rhythm of home. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the garden. Samuel slowed the swing, his hands lingering on the ropes. Lila reached for his finger, her touch light but sure. Ivy's hum softened, her eyes meeting his. Serenity stepped back, her presence a quiet gift. "You're here," she said, and Samuel nodded, his voice breaking. "I am." The mansion wasn't silent anymore. It had a heartbeat, one he'd helped find. The mansion's heartbeat echoes still, a rhythm born from Samuel's journey through grief to presence, from Serenity's quiet strength, and from Lila and Ivy's fragile trust. Their story, woven in a sprawling American estate, speaks of love that breaks the silence, of family found in those who stay. What did this tale stir in you? Did Samuel's awakening, Serenity's gift, or the twins' laughter spark hope in your heart? Share your thoughts below. Let us hear your voice. Thank you for walking this path with us, for feeling every hum, every reach. Your presence brings these stories to life. Until we meet again in another tale of heart and healing, keep listening, keep loving, keep staying.